Arthur Green, a 92-year-old war hero, faces a heart-wrenching clash at his town's war memorial, now threatened by bulldozers for a condo project. Clutching a flag tied to a promise to a fallen comrade, he's detained by an overzealous officer. As Arthur falls, the flag slips, and bystanders watch in stunned silence. Then, three black SUVs screech to a halt. A mysterious man in a suit steps out, his presence shifting the air. Who is he? Why does he know Arthur? The scene teeters on the edge of revelation, leaving the crowd and us hungry for answers. If Arthur's quiet courage moved you, join us in honoring unsung heroes. Like, subscribe, and share this story to keep their legacies alive. Comment with your own stories of dignity and respect. Support our channel to ensure these powerful narratives continue inspiring change. Thank you for watching. The officer's voice cut through the crisp Vermont morning like a blade, sharp and unyielding. "What do you think you're doing, old man?" he demanded, his hand clamping onto Arthur Green's frail wrist with a force that spoke of impatience rather than malice. At 92, Arthur's body was a fragile vessel, his skin thin as parchment, but his grip on the folded American flag was fierce, unyielding, as if the stars and stripes were an extension of his very soul. His fingers, gnarled by time, tightened around the cloth, a silent vow pulsing through his trembling hands. He had come to the town's war memorial, as he had every day for decades, to honor a promise carved deep into his heart, a promise now threatened by the low growl of bulldozers circling the sacred ground like predators waiting to strike. "You're trespassing! Let it go!" the officer barked, twisting Arthur's arm with a roughness that betrayed his frustration. Arthur stumbled, his knees buckling under the weight of age and the sudden jolt. He fell to one knee, pain flaring through his brittle joints, the flag slipping just slightly from his grasp, its edges brushing the cold, unforgiving earth. The ache in his body was nothing compared to the one in his chest, a grief older than the officer, older than the bystanders who stood frozen, their breaths forming faint clouds in the morning chill. One onlooker, a young woman with wide eyes, fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she began to film, the camera capturing the quiet tragedy unfolding. Arthur's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of memory. The flag was more than fabric. It was a lifeline to a past he refused to let go, a promise he had carried through war and loss and the slow march of years. Then a new sound shattered the tension, a low, commanding rumble of engines, and three black SUVs tore around the corner, their tires screeching as they halted with military precision. Doors flung open, and from the lead vehicle stepped a man in a dark suit, his presence as sharp and deliberate as the creases in his jacket. His eyes, steady and piercing, locked onto the officer gripping Arthur's wrist. "Unhand him now," he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that silenced the air itself. The officer's grip faltered, his bravado crumbling under the stranger's gaze. The bystanders shifted uneasily, their murmurs fading into the weight of the moment. No one knew who this man was, only that his arrival had changed everything, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the scene. Arthur, still clutching the flag, felt a flicker of hope stir in his chest, though it was tempered by the heavy grief that had brought him here. Arthur Green's life had always been one of quiet endurance, a whisper against the clamor of a world that had long since moved on. In a small Vermont town, where the skeletons of old factories rusted beneath the weight of forgotten prosperity, he lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a shuttered barbershop. The space smelled of polished wood and time, its simplicity a reflection of a man who had distilled his life to its essentials. A black and white photograph of a young platoon sat on a bookshelf, their faces frozen in a moment of camaraderie that Arthur could still feel in his bones, each smile a reminder of those who never came home. A single recliner, its leather worn smooth by years of quiet evenings, faced an old radio that crackled with classical music or the occasional news broadcast. There was no television, no need for the noise of modern life. At 92, Arthur moved with the careful deliberation of someone who carried not just his own weight, but the ghosts of others, friends, comrades, promises unkept. Each step was a tribute, each breath a reminder of those who no longer drew air. Every morning, whether under the weight of snow, the blaze of summer sun, or the cascade of autumn leaves, Arthur made his pilgrimage to the town's war memorial, a modest granite monument tucked in a forgotten corner of a public park now slated for redevelopment. For over 40 years, he had walked the same path, his gray coat fraying at the cuffs, his gait slow but resolute. To most, he was a fixture, an old man with a folded flag and a story no one bothered to ask about. Some nodded as they passed, others barely noticed, their eyes skimming over him as if he were part of the landscape. A few whispered that he was tethered to a past long gone, a relic of a time no one cared to remember. But they couldn't see the weight he carried, the promise stitched into the fabric of the flag he held. It had been given to him by Helen Whitmore, the younger sister of Corporal Thomas Whitmore, Arthur's closest friend from the Korean War. The two had grown up in neighboring streets, their boyhoods filled with shared dreams, racing bikes down dirt roads, sneaking apples from the neighbor's orchard, promising to always have each other's backs. They enlisted together, trained together, and shipped out to Korea with the naive courage of youth, believing they were invincible. Before they left, Helen, barely 16, pressed the folded flag into Arthur's hands. Her initials, a tiny H embroidered in the corner, were a quiet plea, her eyes brimming with a fear she tried to hide. "Bring this back to me," she had said, her voice trembling, "and bring him home too." Only one of those promises survived the frozen nightmare of the Chosin Reservoir. Thomas fell in the chaos, his body lost to the snow and the enemy, his laughter silenced forever. Arthur, wounded 3 times, twice presumed dead, clung to life with the flag pressed against his chest, its fabric stained with blood and frost. When he returned to Vermont, he carried the weight of that failure, not just to Helen, whose grief he could barely face, but to himself. He didn't chase glory or recognition. The Medal of Honor he earned stayed hidden in a drawer, its weight too heavy to wear, a reminder of the cost of survival. He worked 33 years at a steel mill, its clang and heat a rhythm that dulled the ache of loss. He never remarried after losing his fiancée to illness during the war, her absence another wound he bore in silence. Arthur's life was shaped by loyalty, to his country, to his friend, to the promises he could still keep. Each year on the anniversary of Thomas's death, he placed the flag beneath the memorial's central pillar, standing in silence as memories flooded back. The sound of Thomas's voice, the warmth of his grin, the cold bite of that Korean winter. Every Sunday, he brushed dirt from the stone and watered the rosebush he'd planted decades ago, its roots as deep as his grief. No one asked why. He never explained. To Arthur, it was sacred, a ritual that kept Thomas alive in his heart. Now, as the city council's redevelopment plans loomed, threatening to erase the memorial for a new commercial project, Arthur's quiet devotion was thrust into conflict. The bulldozers, the officer's rough hand, the indifferent stares, they were all intrusions on a promise he had kept for over half a century. His heart ached as he knelt in the dirt, the flag still in his grasp, its weight both a burden and a lifeline. Yet, in that moment, with the stranger's voice cutting through the tension, Arthur felt something shift. His knees ached, his hands trembled, but the flag remained his anchor, a symbol of everything he had lost and everything he still fought for. The news of transforming the park into a gleaming luxury condo complex struck Arthur Green like a blow to the chest, unearthing a raw, aching grief he thought he'd buried long ago. The memorial, a humble patch of earth that held the weight of countless sacrifices, would be shrunken to a mere ornament, a footnote in the shadow of towering glass and steel. The rose bush he'd planted with his own hands, its roots entwined with memories of fallen comrades, was slated to be ripped out and paved over. To Arthur, this wasn't just a change in zoning. It was an act of erasure, a deliberate attempt to wipe clean the blood-soaked legacy of those who had fought and died. At 78, with his body slowed by time and his heart heavy with decades of unspoken pain, Arthur felt a fire kindling deep within, a resolve to honor a promise he'd made long ago, not just to his brothers in arms, but to himself. He knew his days were numbered, but the thought of standing by while the town desecrated hallowed ground was unbearable by. With hands that trembled, not from fear but from purpose, he prepared for a walk that would define his final chapter, a quiet act of defiance that would echo the weight of every name etched into the memorial's granite. The trouble didn't start with the roar of heavy machinery or the clang of a metal mesh. It started with a single sentence buried in the urban city's spring agenda, a cold, bureaucratic phrase that slipped past most residents like a whisper in a storm. Rezone parcel 27B for commercial mixed use. Consolidate Memorial Green into traffic island adjacent to median. To the distracted masses, it was just another civic formality, a piece of jargon to be skimmed and forgotten. But to the small circle of veterans who still gathered at the park, their monthly vigils, a ritual of remembrance, it was a betrayal so profound it left them reeling. Parcel 27B wasn't just land, it was their land, a sacred square of grass and stone where memories were tended like fragile blooms. The proposed traffic island was nothing more than a glorified strip of pavement, a forgotten patch suffocated by the fumes of passing cars, a place unworthy of the solemnity of their loss. Arthur had endured countless callousness in his life. War had forged a heart tough enough to withstand the world's cruelties, but this felt different. This felt like someone trying to scrub away the soul of the place, to reduce a sanctuary to a footnote in a developer's blueprint. For nearly half a century, that modest park had stood as a quiet sentinel of sacrifice. It wasn't much to look at, a few granite slabs, their surfaces weathered but dignified, bearing the names of men who'd never come home, a lone flagpole, its colors snapping in the wind, and Arthur's rosebush, planted decades ago behind the central stone, its blossoms a silent tribute to those who'd paid the ultimate price. It wasn't a place that drew crowds or made headlines, but it was sacred to the men who knew its cost. When word of the rezoning spread among the town's aging veterans, men with stooped shoulders, service pins glinting faintly on their jackets, and memories that haunted their dreams, a quiet resistance took root. They weren't the type to chain themselves to trees or shout into megaphones. They were survivors, men who'd seen enough of war to value peace, but they couldn't stay silent. Twice a week they gathered at the memorial, setting up folding chairs on the grass and holding signs that spoke their truth. Honor the fallen, not developers. This ground was paid for in blood. Their protest was small, almost invisible to a town consumed by progress. But to them, it was everything. The local press barely noticed. Younger passers-by, their eyes fixed on screens or their own hurried lives, walked past without a second glance. The mayor, with his polished speeches about downtown revitalization and desperately needed parking, called their concerns respectful but outdated, as though their pain could be dismissed as nostalgia. Behind closed doors, the real story was starkly different. A developer named Robert Winston, a man with deep pockets and deeper political connections, had set his sights on the land. To him, he saw the park was just a plot on a map, its history irrelevant next to the promise of profit. He'd worked the city's council with charm and pressure, as his vision of luxury condos, example, and retail spaces drowned out the faint voices of a few old men. Arthur wasn't standalone at first. He stood shoulder to shoulder with others who shared his resolve. A Navy cook named Harry Landon, whose hands still trembled with the phantom heat of Saigon's kitchens, his hands aching for the ladle he'd once wielded with pride. A Marine named Robert Hatcher, whose limping gait from a wound in Hue had never healed fully, each step a testament to of his survival. And a quiet soul named John Perkins, whose quiet strength carried the unending grief of a brother buried in Normandy grave, a loss that had shaped his every waking day. They didn't want a war. They'd fought enough of those. They just wanted peace for their park to stand, untouched. But time was relentless, as cruel as ever. Harry's cough worsened into a hospital stay, then a permanent absence that left a void. Robert moved west to live with his daughter, his heart heavy with the distance from the park he loved. John's knees finally betrayed him, leaving him confined to his home, his spirit dimmed by pain and isolation. One by one, their group faded, until only Arthur stood alone remained, a solitary warrior figure in a fight that seemed all but doomed. The day the demolition crews arrived, there was no fanfare, no warning, just a sudden clatter of chain-link fencing and the piercing stab of orange flags into the earth. Arthur stood outside the barrier, his heart pounding with a mix of sorrow and righteous fury, as his rosebush was encircled by caution tape, like a prisoner awaiting execution. The flagpole, proud and silent, was caged behind metal mesh, and one of the granite slabs bore the ugly scar of spray paint. Move. He clutched a folded flag, a gift from a widow named Helen Whitmore, a widow whose husband's name was among those carved in stone. It was a symbol of everything he'd fought for, everything he'd lost. No one else came. The town moved on, indifferent, as workers unloaded their machines, boxing in the past like debris to be cleared. Arthur didn't shout or argue. He just stood there, the weight of those names, the men he'd laughed with, bled with, buried, pressing on his chest like a final command. He couldn't let it end like this, not without a fight. That night he returned to his small, quiet home, his steps heavy with purpose. Kneeling by his bed, he pulled out an old wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of careful handling. Inside were the essentials of a life defined by duty: a faded service ribbon, a photograph of his unit, a letter from a friend who'd never made it home. As he laid them out, his hands steadied, his heart resolute. Arthur Green, the old soldier, was preparing for the most important walk of his life, a walk to ensure that the memories of those he loved and the ground they died for would not be forgotten. The dawn broke cold and gray, a biting wind slicing through the quiet streets as Arthur Green made his way toward the war memorial, just as he had every November for 4 decades. In his hands, cradled with the tenderness of a father holding a newborn, was the flag, folded with precision, wrapped in clear protective plastic, its stars and stripes a silent testament to promises kept. Tucked into his coat pocket were relics of a life shaped by duty, a Medal of Honor citation, its ink faded but its weight undiminished, a letter from Helen, its paper brittle and yellowed, her words still whispering love and loss, and a map of the original memorial design, creased from years of unfolding and refolding. These were his anchors, grounding him to a past he could not, would not, let slip away. Today he wore his usual attire, a heavy wool coat, gloves to shield his arthritic hands, and a scarf wound tightly against the chill. Each step was deliberate, measured, a rhythm born of resolve. The cold stung his weathered face, but he welcomed it, the sharp bite a reminder that he was still here, still breathing, still carrying the weight for those who no longer could. But the memorial was not as he remembered it. Where once stood an open plaza, a place of reverence and reflection, there was now a chain-link fence, its metal glinting like a torch under the weak morning light. Beyond it, bulldozers loomed like slumbering giants, their tracks etched into the earth, poised to erase history in the name of progress. A red sign screamed its warning: danger, demolition zone, no trespassing. To Arthur, it was not a warning but a betrayal, a broken vow to those whose names were carved into the stone beyond. He paused at the fence, his breath visible in the frigid air, and gently unwrapped the flag. His hands, trembling not from age but from the weight of memory, held the fabric as if it were sacred. The stars gleamed faintly, the stripes a roadmap of sacrifice. He didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't rail against the injustice. He simply scanned the fence for a way in, his eyes settling on a small gap near a rose bush that had somehow endured the chaos of construction. It was a tiny rebellion, that bush, its thorns defiant against the encroaching steel. Then came the voice, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the stillness. "Sir, step away from the fence." Officer Ryan Rand stood a few paces away, his square jaw set, mirrored sunglasses reflecting Arthur's stooped figure. Young, brash, and new to the force, Rand carried the weight of his badge like a chip on his shoulder, eager to prove his authority. He had seen Arthur before, an old man who lingered too long at the memorial, a relic who didn't understand boundaries or progress. To Rand, Arthur was a nuisance, a stubborn shadow of a bygone era. Arthur didn't turn, his focus fixed on the gap in the fence, the flag still cradled in his hands. "I won't be long," he said softly, his voice steady but heavy with purpose. "I just need to place this. It's for a friend." Rand took a step closer, his boots clicking on the pavement. "This area is restricted. I need you to move along immediately." His tone was clipped, a rehearsed command from a man who saw rules as unyielding truths. Arthur finally turned, his eyes meeting the officer's mirrored gaze. They were old eyes etched with lines of grief and resilience, eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by a badge. "I've been doing this for 40 years, he said, his voice calm but unyielding, a quiet force that carried the weight of decades. "Every November. This isn't about me, it's about them." He gestured faintly toward the memorial, toward the names etched in stone, names he could recite in his sleep, names that haunted his dreams. Rand's jaw tightened, his patience thinning. "You can honor them from behind the fence like everyone else. I'm not going to tell you again." His words were a wall, unmovable, but Arthur was no stranger to walls. He had faced them before. Enemy fire, frozen winters, the silence of a world that moved on without those he loved. He took a slow breath, the air sharp in his lungs, and stepped toward the gap by the rosebush. He moved not with defiance, but with reverence, each step a prayer for those he had promised to remember. The flag trembled in his hands, its folds catching the light. Rand moved faster than Arthur expected. Without another word, the officer's hand clamped onto Arthur's left arm, the grip hard and mechanical, a force too strong for a man whose bones were more memory than strength. Arthur stumbled, his knees catching on the uneven ground. The flag slipped slightly in his grasp, its protective wrap crinkling. "Stop resisting!" Rand barked, his voice echoing with the rote authority of a training manual. "I'm not," Arthur gasped, his free hand instinctively shielding the flag, his body twisting to protect it. But Rand was relentless, twisting Arthur's arm behind his back with a force that sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder. Arthur's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the pavement, the impact reverberating through his frail frame. The flag slipped from his hands, landing on the cold concrete, its folds unfurling like a wound exposed. The sight of it, creased, sacred, now stained with dirt, cut deeper than the pain in his shoulder, deeper than the humiliation of being forced to the ground. Rand reached for his cuffs, his movements mechanical, his voice cold. "You're under arrest for unlawful trespassing and disobeying a lawful order." Arthur's body trembled, not from fear, but from a quiet, searing shame. "I'm not resisting," he whispered, his voice barely audible. A plea not for himself, but for the flag, for the promise it represented. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. A man pulled out his phone, the lens capturing Arthur's humiliation in cold pixels. A child clung to their mother's coat, eyes wide with confusion. A voice muttered, "He's just an old man." Another replied, "Should have followed the law." The words stung, each one a reminder of how the world had changed, how the sacrifices he honored were fading into indifference. Arthur's world narrowed to the flag on the ground, its colors dulled by the dust. He thought of Helen, her letter still tucked in his pocket, her words a lifeline through the years of loss. He thought of the men whose names were carved into the memorial, men who had laughed with him, fought with him, died beside him. He thought of the promise he had made, to carry their memory, to stand for them when no one else would. The pain in his shoulder was nothing compared to the ache in his heart, the fear that this moment, this desecration, was a sign that their sacrifices were being forgotten. He wanted to stand, to pick up the flag, to place it where it belonged, but Rand's grip held him down, the cuffs cold against his wrists. And yet, even in this moment, Arthur was not silent. His silence was not surrender. It was a vow, a refusal to let the world forget. The gravel crunched underfoot, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to echo the tension in the air. The chain-link fence scraped as it was pushed aside, its metallic whine cutting through the quiet morning. Arthur felt the weight of eyes on him, each stare heavy with judgment, as if his simple act of honoring a fallen comrade made him a threat. His heart thudded, not with fear, but with a quiet, stubborn resolve. He had faced worse, far worse, on the frozen slopes of Chosin Reservoir, where the ground was slick with blood and the air thick with gunpowder. This was nothing, he told himself, just another moment to endure. But the flag, that sacred scrap of cloth, fluttered faintly in the breeze, teasing the edge of his vision. His sore, trembling fingers reached for it instinctively, desperate to keep it from drifting away, from being lost to the wind and the indifference of the world. Then came the sharp yank on his arm. Officer Rand, young and rigid with authority, jerked Arthur's wrist higher, twisting it just enough to send a jolt of pain through his old bones. A cry escaped Arthur's lips, short, sharp, raw with frustration and a flicker of betrayal. The flag slipped from his grasp, falling to the pavement like a wounded bird. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with the weight of what was happening. Arthur, a man who had once stood unflinching against enemy fire, now lay face down on the cold asphalt, his wrists bound in cuffs like some common criminal. The flag, the symbol of his brother in arms, lay just inches away, crumpled and out of reach. His chest tightened, not from the pressure of the ground, but from the ache of seeing that flag discarded, disrespected. He wanted to scream, to demand why honoring the dead was treated like a crime, but his voice caught in his throat, silenced by the weight of the moment. Around him, the crowd watched in uneasy silence. Most turned their eyes away, unwilling to meet the scene head-on, as if witnessing Arthur's humiliation might somehow implicate them. A man with a phone recording the ordeal hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen as if questioning whether this was worth capturing. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken questions and the faint hum of disapproval. Then, cutting through the stillness, came a sound, a low, deep rumble, not of sirens or shouts, but something else entirely. Tires, big ones, rolling fast over the pavement. The wind shifted, carrying the sound closer, and it was like the growl of some ancient beast waking from slumber. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, commanding attention. Heads turned, conversations died, and even the man with the phone lowered it, sensing that something bigger was unfolding. At the far end of the street, 3 black SUVs emerged from the early morning light, their sleek forms cutting through the haze with predatory grace. No flashing lights, no blaring sirens, just smooth, unyielding precision, as if their presence alone was enough to claim authority. They moved like they belonged, like the street itself had been waiting for their arrival. Officer Rand glanced up, his brow furrowing with irritation. "Crowd control," he muttered under his breath, tightening his grip on Arthur's arm and giving it another tug, as if to reassert his control. But the SUVs didn't slow or pull to the side. They swerved in unison, aligning side by side to form a barricade across the street. The screech of rubber against asphalt rang out, sharp and final, echoing off the nearby buildings. The world seemed to pause. Every whisper, every shuffle, every breath in a 2-block radius fell silent. Doors opened as one, and 4 men stepped out. Tall, clean-cut, dressed in sharp black suits, they moved with a quiet confidence that needed no explanation. Their earpieces caught the light, glinting like tiny stars, and their eyes scanned the scene with the precision of soldiers assessing a battlefield. But it was the 5th man, stepping from the lead SUV, who shifted the air entirely. He was older, in his late 60s, with silver hair cropped close and a posture that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. His navy suit was tailored to perfection, not flashy but commanding, as if it carried the weight of a uniform he no longer wore. His walk was measured, each step deliberate, cutting through the crowd like a blade through water. The people parted without a word, instinct guiding them to make way. Arthur didn't see him at first. His face was still pressed to the pavement, his breath ragged, his fingers twitching toward the flag that lay just beyond his reach. Every muscle in his body ached, not just from the fall, but from the weight of memory. The faces of those he'd fought beside, the ones who never came home. He could still hear their voices sometimes, faint but persistent, urging him to keep going, to never let their sacrifice be forgotten. The fouette was more than cloth. It was a promise, one he'd sworn to keep. And now here he was, humiliated, helpless, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and grief. The older man stopped short, his eyes locking onto Arthur's crumpled form. His face flickered. Disbelief, then recognition, then something deeper, something raw and unspoken. Pain, regret. A memory stirred, sharp and unbidden, of nights spent in foxholes, of shared cigarettes and whispered stories under a sky torn by war. He broke into a stride, moving straight toward Arthur, the crowd melting away before him. Even the man with the phone stepped back, sensing the shift in gravity. Officer Rand noticed the approach but held his ground, his grip on Arthur's arm unyielding. "This is a police matter," he snapped, his voice sharp with defiance. "Please step back." The man didn't respond. He didn't need to. He stopped 2 feet from Arthur and crouched slightly, his eyes fixed on the weathered face looking up from the pavement. Arthur's vision was blurred, cold, and the sting of tears he refused to acknowledge. But the voice that came next cut through the haze. "Arthur Green, is that really you?" Low, firm, but laced with something softer. Something that carried the weight of years. Arthur blinked, his mind scrambling to place the sound. It was familiar, like a song half remembered, pulling him back to a time when hope and fear were two sides of the same coin. Then it hit him. Marcus. The name landed like a stone in still water, rippling through his chest. Rand, still clutching Arthur's arm, looked confused, his authority wavering under the older man's gaze. "Sir, I said," he began, but the man rose to his full height, turning to face him. His voice remained calm, but it carried an unshakable weight, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Unhand him now." Rand hesitated, his jaw tightening, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "You don't have jurisdiction." The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of misunderstanding and unacknowledged history. Colonel Marcus Langford, a man whose name alone commanded respect, stood resolute on the cracked sidewalk, his presence a quiet storm amidst the chaos. His eyes, weathered by years of service and softened by personal loss, fixed on the scene before him. Arthur Green, an elderly man with a stooped frame but an unyielding spirit, trembling slightly as the handcuffs fell from his wrists with a metallic clatter. Langford's heart clenched at the sight, not out of pity, but out of reverence for a man whose sacrifices had shaped his own life in ways few could comprehend. With a gentle but unyielding motion, Langford reached forward, his fingers brushing against Arthur's arm as he eased Rand's grip away. The officer, Rand, stood frozen, his face draining of color as the weight of his actions began to dawn on him. Langford didn't need to raise his voice. His authority was woven into every deliberate movement, every measured word. "Here, sir," he said softly to Arthur, his tone laced with a respect that bordered on devotion. "I don't need jurisdiction. I need your respect." The words hung in the air, a quiet rebuke that cut deeper than any shout could have. Arthur flinched at the sound of the handcuffs hitting the ground, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment his eyes, clouded by age but sharp with memory, met Langford's, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. The crowd, a growing knot of onlookers drawn by the commotion, began to whisper. "Colonel Marcus Langford," someone murmured, the name rippling through the gathering like a current. A retired commander decorated for valor, feared by those who had crossed him, and cherished by those who had served under his command. His legacy was a living thing, and now it stood embodied in this moment, shielding Arthur from further indignity. Langford placed a steady hand on Arthur's shoulder, his grip firm but tender, as if anchoring the older man to the present while honoring his past. "Help me up, son," Arthur whispered, his voice frail but carrying the weight of decades. Langford's chest tightened at the word son, a term that stirred memories of his own father, a man whose story was inextricably tied to Arthur's. "I've got you," Langford replied, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. With care, he helped Arthur to his feet, guiding him as though he were lifting a piece of history itself. Turning to the officers, Langford's gaze sharpened. Rand, now pale and visibly shaken, stood rooted to the spot, while Cates, his partner, kept his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet the colonel's stare. The crowd fell silent, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. Langford's voice, though calm, carried an edge that sliced through the tension. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" he asked, his words directed at the officers but loud enough for all to hear. "This man held the perimeter at the Chosin Reservoir when every other line collapsed. This man saved 37 lives, including mine. He didn't back down in war, and you dare lay a hand on him in peace?" The words landed like a blow and no one moved. Rand's mouth opened, but no sound came out, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Langford's truth. Cates shifted uncomfortably, his guilt etched into the lines of his face. The crowd, too, seemed to hold its breath, their earlier curiosity replaced by a mix of awe and shame. Langford turned away from the officers, his attention drawn to the flag lying discarded on the ground, its faded stripes a silent testament to sacrifice. He bent down, his movements deliberate, and lifted it with a reverence that silenced the murmurs around him. His fingers brushed the dust from its folds, lingering on the fabric as though it held the weight of every life it had touched. He turned back to Arthur, his voice softening, breaking slightly under the strain of memory. "You carried this for him," he said, his eyes searching Arthur's face. "All this time?" Arthur nodded, his throat tight with emotion, unable to find words. The flag, small and worn, was more than cloth. It was a promise kept, a bond unbroken. Langford held it up, letting the crowd see it clearly, his voice rising just enough to carry down the street. "Then we'll carry you now." For a moment, Langford stood silent, the flag cradled in his hands. His fingers traced the faded embroidery near the edge, pausing on the single letter H stitched in the corner. His heart lurched as recognition flooded him. Helen Whitmore, his aunt, whose hands had sewn that letter with love and hope so many years ago. He glanced at Arthur, then at the officers, and finally turned to face the crowd, now thick with onlookers. Their phones were lowered, their heads tilted forward, waiting for something, clarity perhaps, or redemption. "I want everyone here to understand exactly what just happened," Langford began, his voice steady but weighted with purpose. "This man is not just a veteran. He is not just someone with the story. He is the story." Ryan shifted his weight, stealing a glance at Cates, who remained motionless, his eyes still averted. Langford raised the flag higher, its folds catching the faint breeze. "This flag was given to Arthur Green by my aunt, Helen Whitmore, on the day he and my father deployed to Korea in 1950. It was meant to bring them both home. Only one of them made it." He paused, his throat tightening, as the memory of his father, Captain Raymond Langford, surfaced. The crowd was silent, the weight of his words settling over them. "My father died at the Chosin Reservoir," Langford continued, his voice steadying as he spoke. "You've heard of it, haven't you? 30 below zero, surrounded, outnumbered 10-1. Arthur held the last defensive line with a dozen men after the rest of the company was wiped out. He took 3 bullets and still carried 2 wounded soldiers to safety. One of them, my father's radio operator, who lived to tell the story." The silence deepened, unbroken even by the wind. Langford stepped closer to Arthur, his eyes never leaving the older man's face. "My father died in his arms," he said softly, the words carrying a grief that time had not dulled. "That was the last message we ever got. And every year since then, Arthur has visited my mother with this flag. Every year until the day she passed." A murmur swept through the crowd, shame, awe, and disbelief blending into a single palpable emotion. Langford's voice grew firmer as he continued, pointing to Arthur, but keeping his gaze on the crowd. "This man right here raised the funds to build this memorial, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. He never asked for recognition. He never asked for credit. He asked only for space, for peace, for remembrance." He turned to Ran, his eyes narrowing, his voice sharpening like a blade. "And you put him on the ground. You twisted the wrist of a man who has more honor in one breath than most of us manage in a lifetime." Ran tried to speak, his lips moving soundlessly, his face a mask of regret. Langford didn't wait for a response. He faced the crowd again, his voice steady but urgent. He didn't come here today for protest. He came to fulfill a promise to my father, to my family, to every soul who never made it home. The flag trembled slightly in his hands, not from weakness, but from the weight of the story it carried. "Arthur Green is not just a hero," Langford said, his voice breaking through the silence like a clarion call. "He is the man who kept our history alive, who carried our memory when we forgot to carry it ourselves." The crowd stood still, their faces a mosaic of emotions, grief, pride, and a quiet resolve to do better. Arthur, standing beside Langford, looked down at the flag, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For him, this moment was not about vindication, but about honoring a bond forged in the crucible of war, a bond that had endured through decades of loss and remembrance. Langford, too, felt the weight of that bond, his heart swelling with gratitude for the man who had carried his father's memory and his family's love through the years. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, Langford folded the flag with care, tucking it under his arm. He placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, guiding him forward, away from the officers, away from the crowd, toward the memorial that Arthur had built with his own hands. The onlookers parted silently, their respect a tangible thing. And in that moment, Arthur Green walked not alone but carried, by Langford, by history, by the weight of a promise kept. The crowd had swelled to an overwhelming size, a sea of faces stretching far beyond what Arthur had ever seen in his 40 years of quiet ritual. Among them stood veterans, some draped in weathered jackets that bore the scars of time, others crowned with faded caps embroidered with emblems that whispered of battles long past. Their presence was a silent testament to shared sacrifice, a bond that needed no words. One veteran, his face etched with lines of both age and resolve, stepped forward. With deliberate care, he removed his cap and pressed it against his chest, his hand trembling slightly over his heart. Others followed, a ripple of reverence spreading through the crowd. Nearby, a mother leaned down to her young son, her voice soft but heavy with meaning as she pointed toward Arthur. The boy, wide-eyed and solemn, nodded as if he understood the weight of the moment, his small face reflecting a pride he couldn't yet fully grasp. Arthur stood at the edge of the scene, his frail frame trembling, not from the chill of the morning air, but from the flood of emotions he could barely contain. For decades, he had come to this place alone, carrying the flag that symbolized promises kept to those who never came home. Today, though, was different. The chain-link fence that had cruelly barred him from the war memorial still loomed, a cold reminder of the redevelopment that threatened to erase this sacred ground. But then Colonel Marcus Langford, a man whose name still echoed with authority in military and federal circles, strode toward the fence. With a single nod to one of his sharply dressed aides, the barrier was unhooked and pulled back just enough to create a narrow passage. Langford turned to Arthur, his steely gaze softening with an unspoken invitation. "Come, Sergeant," he said, his voice steady and warm. "Let's do this right." Arthur hesitated, his knees buckling under the weight of the moment. Doubt flickered in his mind. Could he still carry this burden, this honor, after all these years? But Langford was already at his side, offering a strong arm with a quiet confidence that seemed to steady not just Arthur's body, but his soul. Together they stepped through the opening, the crowd parting before them like a river yielding to a stone. No one cheered, no one clapped. The silence was profound, a collective holding of breath that wrapped the moment in a sacred stillness. Each step toward the memorial stones felt like a pilgrimage, every footfall a prayer for those whose names were carved into the granite ahead. As they approached, Langford leaned close, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you know why I came today?" he asked. Arthur, his heart pounding, shook his head, too overwhelmed to speak. Langford's lips curved into a faint, almost wistful smile. "Because I saw the footage. Someone sent it to me, and the moment I saw your face, I dropped everything. You saved my family once, Sergeant. I wasn't about to let anyone disgrace yours." The words struck Arthur like a thunderbolt, unearthing memories he had buried deep. Memories of a frozen battlefield, of lives pulled from the jaws of death, of a young Langford whose family had been among those he'd shielded. His lips quivered, and for the first time in years, tears welled in his tired, weathered eyes, spilling over to trace the lines of a face that had seen too much loss. They reached the rose bush, a stubborn miracle still blooming amid the rubble of the construction site. Its delicate petals seemed to defy the chaos around it, a symbol of resilience that mirrored Arthur's own. With Langford's steady hand supporting him, Arthur knelt slowly, his joints protesting, but his spirit unyielding. He laid the flag down at the base of the central pillar, its folds settling gently against the earth. His hand lingered over the fabric, fingers brushing the stars and stripes as if they could carry his thoughts to the comrades he'd lost. Bowing his head, he whispered words meant only for the dead, a private vow, a final farewell, a promise kept. In that moment, the city's clamor faded, the hum of progress, the grind of machinery, the buzz of life. All of it fell silent, as if even the world itself paused to honor the weight of Arthur's devotion. By midday, the story had already begun to spread. Grainy phone videos captured the shocking moment when a 92-year-old Medal of Honor recipient, a hero of the Chosin Reservoir, had been tackled by a local officer named Rand while trying to honor his fallen comrades. The footage showed Langford's swift intervention, his commanding presence cutting through the chaos as he demanded Arthur's release. By sunset, the story had exploded beyond the town's borders. News stations across the country picked it up, their headlines searing. Medal of Honor, veteran detained while honoring fallen comrade. Hero humiliated in hometown. Langford, identified as a retired colonel with a storied career, became a central figure in the narrative, his name lending gravitas to the unfolding drama. The public's reaction was swift and fierce. Groups from coast to coast demanded accountability, their voices rising in a chorus of outrage. Hundreds of emails flooded the city council's inbox, each one a plea for justice, a call to protect the legacy of a man who had given so much. Even the governor, sensing the political firestorm, issued a statement condemning the incident. The mayor's office, caught off guard by the backlash, scrambled to respond, releasing a carefully crafted apology about regretful miscommunication and promising an internal review. But the words rang hollow against the raw emotion of the public's anger. The next morning, Langford walked into the mayor's office with a quiet determination that needed no fanfare. He carried a folder, its contents a testament to Arthur's life of service. Inside were photographs of the memorial's creation, donation records detailing Arthur's tireless fundraising, and letters from families who owed their lives to his courage. There was also a list of names, survivors Arthur had rescued during the war, some still alive, others with children now serving in uniform. The weight of those documents was undeniable, a silent demand for respect that no politician could ignore. The city had no choice but to act. Within 48 hours, the redevelopment plan that threatened the memorial was suspended indefinitely. The company behind the proposed parking garage, sensing the shifting tide, quietly withdrew its bid. A deeper investigation soon uncovered a web of questionable dealings, backroom agreements, favors traded for zoning leniency, and missing environmental assessments that should have halted the project long ago. The city council, desperate to distance itself from the scandal, issued public statements pledging transparency and reform. As for Officer Rand, the public's judgment was unrelenting. The backlash forced the police department to place him on administrative leave pending a review. He was later reassigned, required to undergo extensive retraining focused on de-escalation, constitutional rights, and sensitivity toward veterans. Days later, in a televised apology, Rand stood before the cameras, his face pale and his voice unsteady. The weight of his actions seemed to press down on him, his words faltering as he expressed remorse. For Arthur, watching from his modest home, the apology was a bittersweet moment, a recognition of the wrong done, but no balm for the deeper wound of seeing his sacred ritual disrupted. Through it all, Arthur remained a quiet figure at the heart of the storm. His thoughts often drifted to the rose bush, to the flag he had laid down, to the names etched in stone. He wondered if his comrades, wherever they were, knew he had kept his promise. And in the stillness of his heart, he felt their presence, a silent assurance that his duty, his life's work, was not in vain. In a crowded room, heavy with tension and unspoken regret, Officer Shaken stood before a sea of faces, his voice trembling, but resolute. He turned his gaze to Arthur Green, seated in the front row, his weathered hands folded quietly in his lap. "Mr. Green," Shaken began, his words carrying the weight of a man confronting his own shortcomings, "I didn't know who you were, but that's no justification. Somewhere along the line, I lost sight of what it means to truly listen, to serve with purpose. I failed you, and for that, I am deeply sorry." His apology hung in the air, raw and unadorned, as Arthur, his expression unreadable, gave a single measured nod. Beside him, Colonel Langford sat in stoic silence, his presence a quiet anchor in the room, his eyes fixed on Shaken with a mixture of judgment and understanding. For Arthur, that nod was more than acknowledgement. It was the culmination of a lifetime of carrying burdens few could see. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight. His heart had always been tethered to a promise made decades ago, to comrades whose names were etched not just in stone, but in the deepest corners of his soul. The incident at the War Memorial had shaken him, not because of the handcuffs or the threat of arrest, but because it felt like a betrayal of that promise. To stand at that fence, clutching a flag worn thin by time, was to stand for every soldier who never came home, every sacrifice that had faded into the background of a bustling world. In that moment, Arthur's quiet defiance wasn't about resistance. It was about remembrance, a refusal to let memory be bulldozed for progress. Officer Cates, the second officer involved, stepped forward next, his own statement laced with a different kind of remorse. He admitted his inaction, the way he'd stood by as the situation escalated, paralyzed by protocol and the fear of making the wrong call. But instead of digging in his heels or deflecting blame, Cates chose a path forward. He requested a transfer to the city's community outreach division, a move that wasn't just professional, but deeply personal. In the months that followed, Cates threw himself into the work with a fervor that surprised even himself. He sought out local veterans, sitting with them over coffee in diner booths or folding chairs at community centers, listening to their stories of service, loss, and resilience. He volunteered at the VA clinic, organizing events and quietly ensuring that those who'd served felt seen. For Cates, it wasn't about atonement. It was about transformation, about learning to hear the voices he'd once overlooked. But the true change wasn't in the apologies or the transfers. It was in what the town chose to preserve. The war memorial, once threatened by the churn of commercial development, became a symbol of something greater. Spurred by public outcry and Colonel Langford's unwavering advocacy, the city council voted unanimously to protect the site, declaring the land sacred, untouchable by the march of progress. The chain-link fences that had cordoned off the memorial were dismantled, the bulldozers hauled away. What emerged in their place was something unexpected, something alive. People began to gather, not just veterans, but families pushing strollers, teenagers with earbuds dangling, retired teachers with thermos cups, and mechanics still in their work boots. They came with small tokens of respect. American flags the size of a hand, bouquets of wildflowers, faded photographs of loved ones who'd served. Some sat on the new bench installed under Arthur's quiet guidance, its wood polished but unassuming, a place to rest and reflect. Others stood in silence, hands pressed over their hearts, tracing the names carved into the stone with their eyes, each letter a story, a life, a legacy. At the base of the memorial, a new bronze plaque gleamed, its words simple yet profound. To those who served and to those who remembered, even when the world forgot. Arthur had insisted his name be left off the inscription. Fame wasn't his aim. It never had been. For him, the memorial was a living testament to the men he'd fought beside, the ones who'd laughed with him in foxholes and held his hand in moments of fear. To stand before it was to feel their presence, to honor a bond that time and indifference could never erode. Every November 27th, Arthur and Colonel Langford returned to the rose bush at the memorial's edge, placing a flag cleanly pressed but never replaced, its frayed edges a testament to years of devotion. Langford, no longer a commander but a friend, stood shoulder to shoulder with Arthur, their silence louder than any speech. For Arthur, these moments were a quiet triumph, not over a system or a city, but over the creeping tide of forgetfulness that threatened to erase what mattered most. Justice in the end didn't arrive with blaring headlines or dramatic arrests. It came in the slow, steady awakening of a community that had finally stopped to listen. It came in the way people began to see Arthur, not as a man in a worn coat clutching a flag, but as a guardian of memory, a keeper of promises. His story wasn't just about a standoff at a fence. It was about the things we choose to notice and the things we let slip by. In a world that moves at breakneck speed, where headlines flash and fade, and strangers pass without a glance, Arthur's quiet courage was a reminder of what lies beneath the surface. He was the man you might overlook at a bus stop, his limp barely noticeable, his old service jacket blending into the crowd. But that jacket carried stories of battles fought, of brothers lost, of a flag that meant more than fabric. How many others, like Arthur, walk among us, their histories tucked into the folds of their silence? How many veterans, caregivers, or elderly neighbors carry burdens we've never paused to ask about? The incident at the memorial exposed more than a single moment of disrespect. It laid bare a deeper truth. In our rush toward progress, we sometimes trample the very memories that anchor us. In the name of efficiency, we sideline dignity. And in our haste to build, we risk burying the foundations that hold us up. Arthur didn't want a statue or a parade, Mirasim. He wanted only to honor the men he'd served with, to keep their names alive in a world that too often forgets. He wasn't resisting arrest that day at the fence. He was resisting oblivion. And the fact that it took a convoy, a colonel, and a viral video to make people notice, that's the part that stings. It's a reminder of the irony that a society that once asked men like Arthur to give everything later asked them to step aside, to be quiet, to not make a fuss. But it was the fuss, the scene, the confrontation that taught the lesson. When the handcuffs came off and the fence came down, it wasn't just a physical barrier that fell, it was a symbolic one, a reopening of a space where dignity could breathe again. The town didn't just save a memorial, it rediscovered its heart. Arthur's quiet act of defiance sparked a reckoning, not because he raised his voice, but because he refused to let memory fade in silence. His story challenges us to do better, to listen to those who came before us, to preserve the places and people that give our communities meaning. It forces us to question how we train those in power, whether police officers or city officials, and to remember that respect isn't a checkbox on a form. It's a way of seeing, a commitment to recognizing the weight of every story, even the ones told in whispers. Arthur Green still walks to the memorial, his steps slower now, his shoulders slightly stooped. He doesn't say much, he never did. But when he kneels to place that flag at the base of the rose bush, people notice, they stop, they watch. Some join him, standing in quiet solidarity, their presence a small but powerful act of remembrance. Arthur never asked to be a hero, never sought to be remembered. But through one moment of unwavering courage, he reminded a town, and perhaps a nation, what it means to truly honor the past. His story is a call to look closer, to pause, to listen. Who in your life is quietly carrying a history that deserves to be heard? Whose name, whose story are you overlooking? The next time you pass someone in an old service jacket or see a figure sitting alone, don't rush by. You might be standing in the presence of someone who has carried more than you'll ever know. And the question remains, will we honor them now while they're still here? Or will we wait for another moment of shame to remind us of what we should have seen all along?